here's our fun little watershed diagram that we just recently had made last summer, which feels like forever ago, when we redid the Greenscapes guide, which if your town is a Greenscapes town, they're probably available somewhere there. But you can also access it online, since obviously it's kind of hard to pick up anything anywhere right now, but it is available online for free. So a watershed, for those that don't know, although I think everyone here knows, but I'm going to go over it anyways, is just an area of land that drains into a specific body of water. So in the water cycle, as we teach the kids, they all very strongly understand evaporation, precipitation, condensation. They've got that down. They're great with it. And we just want to make sure that they remember that an important part of the water cycle is what happens when that water falls to the ground as precipitation. And that our whole environment is an important part of that system. And the more nice green areas that are great at getting water into the ground, absorbing it, letting it filter through the groundwater, the cleaner our water is and the more plentiful it is. And so here's my fun facts for you. What is the largest watershed on Earth? If you know it, you can put it into the chat. Oh, I'll give you a little moment. Oh, you guys have the correct largest watershed for a river on Earth, but the largest watershed on Earth is that of the Atlantic Ocean. Actually larger watershed than the Pacific. There's more landmass dedicated to it, surprisingly. So the largest watershed in America, not including that for any sea or ocean. And a couple of you got it in the chat. It is indeed the Mississippi. And I love referencing the Mississippi watershed because it is massive. It's several states wide. It goes up to Canada and all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. It's a massive watershed, and it really helps explain how contamination in the groundwater in one area can travel a very large distance and impact people that are otherwise thinking they're not connected at all. So water really connects all of us. So it's really important that we care for it because we can have an impact on people far, far away. And watersheds, as I've mentioned, have very different sizes. That each watershed sometimes has sub-watersheds within it. So the Ipswich River watershed, my favorite watershed, you can see here on the map. So it's actually pretty big. It's like a long sort of shape. I always think it kind of looks like an otter on its side. And it's home to approximately, yeah, right? It looks like an otter. It's home to approximately 160,000 people. It's got all or portions of 21 different towns. It's part of the Great Marsh ecosystem. It's supporting a lot of businesses as well, about 350,000 businesses and people. 14 different communities rely on the Ipswich River for their drinking water, including areas that are outside the watershed. So I'm sure you guys know that Wenham Lake and Putnamville Reservoir are reservoirs for Beverly and Salem, and they're sub-watersheds of the Ipswich River watershed. So it's a really important watershed, and a particularly beautiful one, I might say. So that's not the only watershed we care about, though. Actually, our partnership spans a few watersheds, and several of you live in towns that have maybe up to 4 or 5 different watersheds within that one town. So Maggie's going to talk about the Salem Sound watershed.
Yeah, so the Salem Sound watershed touches at least 6 main communities, being Marblehead, Salem, Beverly, Peabody, Danvers, and Manchester. But you can see on this little map that it is in the outskirts of a couple other towns as well, Essex, Wenham, we've snuck in there a little bit. And the Salem Sound watershed is a sub-watershed of the larger North Coastal watershed, which kind of wraps its way around the Ipswich River. So again, we are all connected. The highest points in Manchester are connected to the lowest points in Salem, et cetera, et cetera. So that watershed in particular is home to over 190,000 people. who use and interact with the water in one way or another. And it's a little bit more of an urban environment compared to Ipswich, Boxford, Topsfield, those sort of communities, but is also home to all sorts of different wildlife, all different kinds of ecosystems, salt and freshwater, forested, marshy, etc. So, you know, as all of you know, and one of the reasons I'm sure why you're here is that we are very closely connected to nature and to water, no matter where we are, which is something that we obviously care a lot about. For better or for worse, sometimes that connection to nature and to water isn't always a positive thing. Stormwater is the #1 cause of non-point source pollution. So non-point source pollution is pollution that can't be tracked to one specific thing, like say a gas leak. You know exactly what address or what location is causing that pollution or where it's stemming from. That isn't the case with stormwater. So that is just a general amassing of pollutants that end up or start on the street. Things like car grease, oil, chemicals from our lawns, gardens, pet waste, bacteria, trash, etc. You've seen it, you know what it is. And those pollutants are carried across impervious surfaces like asphalt sidewalks, our streets and roads, where the water is moving a lot faster than it would move over a grassy or vegetated area like a garden. And so those pollutants end up in our water bodies through our storm drains, carried over those surfaces.
And as this slide says, that those surfaces are increasing. So obviously, whenever you're bringing new roads into areas, new parking lots for new businesses, and you know, even rooftops, that's creating more and more of these impervious areas. And also, when land is getting developed, a lot of the green infrastructure already in place, trees and shrubs and things like that, are being cleared out to make way for that building. So it's not simply an addition of impervious area, but also a loss of that acreage. So what does that mean when looking at the general scope of climate change, the climate crisis, and how those all are interwoven? Well, we looked at the watershed diagram earlier and talked about the water cycle. So we're seeing that there is an uptick in really heavy, intense rain events and overall rain. But at the same time, when we get our most rain, it's usually between October and kind of mid-May. Those are not the times when we're using the most water. So we are getting these really severe rain events, and they don't really have anywhere to go. They're hitting all this impervious surface, and they only have, you know, the choice to move across until they go directly into a water body, or until they find somewhere where they can absorb, whether that's a grassy swale or a lawn, or hopefully a forest or marsh. Marsh are excellent at absorbing water. They're also carbon sinks. But when we get into the summers, we're seeing increasingly hot days, and we're seeing longer stretches of no precipitation. So it's not equal, even though we may get historic rainfall for the year. The times when we're really using it and really need it are not necessarily the times that we're getting it. So when we are getting it, where can it go, and what does it do when it's moving around?
And so we, you know, some people argue that more rain is good, that, you know, that's immediately replenishing all of our water resources like the Ipswich River. But unfortunately, that's not always true. Rachel just touched on the time of year that we're getting that rain, and the flash storms and things are not replenishing our water resources in the way that we need them to. And those big increases of runoff also carry a big increase of those harmful chemicals or pollutants that they carry. In some communities, they can also lead to combined sewer overflows. So where the infrastructure would allow for, when the sewer system is overwhelmed with the sewer water, and then additionally that increased storm water, in communities like Lowell, Haverhill, Lawrence, where their systems are combined, that raw sewage is then allowed to overflow the system and go directly into the nearest water body, like the Merrimack River in that case. So our infrastructure needs to change, obviously, and needs to change quickly with this expectation for increased rain and how we're going to handle it in our communities.
And it's also interesting to note that even getting lots of rain and having flooding doesn't necessarily mean you won't also have a drought. If any of you have read anything about Mexico City and their problems dealing with simultaneous drought and flooding, it's pretty interesting to see how the way that you build up a city really impacts your water issues. So in the Ipswich River watershed, you can see from this map, the little red dots mean that those are not great areas for aquatic life. Green dot means it's good. Yellow dot means they're stressed. And there are a lot of different things that impact the river's ability and tributaries' ability to support life. Dissolved oxygen is one that we test in our River Watch program, but certainly the presence of pollutions. So for the Ipswich River, stormwater pollution is our main pollutant. And you can see it's in more densely populated areas, more densely developed, that we really see those impacts. Luckily, the Ipswich River watershed has a lot of conservation land and a very diverse amount of conservation land. There's Audubon property, there's Greenbelt property, trustees property, there's town conservation land, there's private land that's been given over as conservation land. So we're really, really lucky up here. And that's why the river is relatively clean, but it takes all of us maintaining that and really protecting it to keep it that way. So we can actually create more buffer zones in our community to keep the river even cleaner. And so essentially greenscapes are like little buffer zones spread out over your community.
And just to talk about the Salem Sound watershed and the issues that we are dealing with, which are very similar to the ones in the river. This map is actually just a different view of the one that you were just looking at, about the Ipswich, but it's cut up regionally, I guess. This is an illustration of DEP's list of water bodies and their different levels of impairment. So, which means not necessarily how dirty they are, but what they may be impaired by or polluted with, and how that affects the different activities that can happen in those water bodies. So whether they're safe for boating and fishing versus clamming and swimming, things like that. So I included the little white cutout map there because historically pollution in Salem Sound has been directly connected to the wastewater treatment that is happening here in Salem. So until 1990, the wastewater system was not nearly as robust as it is now, and it was dumping essentially raw sewage into where that black dot is on the map, which you can also see corresponds directly to the red portion of the viewer. So this map was last updated in 2014, and I'd like to think that we have seen great improvements since then even. But again, just connecting human behavior to water quality in our communities, so that the wastewater system is not dumping raw waste into the harbor anymore. But it is, has become more urban and more developed. And so we may be contributing other things now. So Salem Sound Coast Watch does annual monitoring in all of our communities. If you want more information about that, I'm happy to share that. And DEP is conducting their own to make sure that beaches are safe for swimming, etc. So this map shouldn't be too scary, and again is a little outdated, but just some background about what we're dealing with. And as far as what we can do about it, how are we going to deal with this increased runoff, and what actions do we really need to be taking? Well, for one, the easiest way to combat pollution is to prevent it from existing on our streets. So picking up trash where you see it, picking up pet waste as soon as you can, not an hour or a day later, using fewer chemicals in your lawn and in your garden, and using specific infrastructure that can help you keep water clean and capture it.